be opening the Bible to Romans chapter 5. We'll be starting here in a few moments with a couple of verses found at 1 and 2. Romans chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Now, I have a number of comments that I would like to make tonight as we bring this meeting to a close. But I feel like maybe it would be better if I reserve those until the end of our time together here this hour, so as to go ahead and get into our study. But suffice it presently to say this: my family and I have greatly enjoyed being with you here this week at Richmond Hill. I believe that this is a loving congregation, a growing congregation, and a congregation that has so much potential for good in the Lord's cause and as part of the Lord's kingdom here upon this earth. And just suffice it to say that for now, but it is certainly good to be with you one more time this week before this meeting comes to a close. Now, if you'll reflect back with me, some of you were not able to be with us Sunday morning as we began with our Bible class hour, but some of you were. And for those of us who were here Sunday morning for the adult class, reflect back with me how that we pointed out from the book of 1 Peter, there are at least 4 prominent themes that can be traced throughout this epistle. These are basically in a particular order. Number 1, grace. Primarily the grace of God. And then number 2, submission. Primarily man's submission to the terms and the conditions of God's grace. Then number 3, the theme of sufferings. Because as we have demonstrated over the course of this meeting, when men and women submit to the plan of God, the world will not react favorably. Satan and his servants will not like that. And so ultimately you and I will be called upon to suffer because of our faith. And then number 4, glory. You know, it's interesting that even though sufferings are mentioned 12 times during the course of 1 Peter, so also the word glory is found 12 times as well in the course of this epistle. And so tonight, what I want us to do for the last session of this meeting, as we bring not only this meeting to a close, but as we also conclude our studies in 1 Peter concerning the true grace of God, I want us tonight to focus on the lesson that I've entitled, God's Grace and Our Glory. God's grace and our glory. Now, friends and brethren, brothers and sisters, let me tell you, God has intended you and me for so much more. So much more than simply what we know or what we see in this life. When God created us in His own divine image, He endowed each one of us with an immortal, eternal soul. And He intended us, He has fitted us for an eternity with Him in glory. But because of our own sin, because of our own shortcoming, we will not experience that eternal glory apart from His divine grace. And so how appropriate, I think, and I hope maybe you feel the same way, how appropriate then that we conclude this meeting by talking about God's grace and our glory. The glory that one day He will bring us to as we are found faithful in His eyes. Okay? Now if you're open to Romans 5, read with me verses 1 and 2 from this chapter. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. You know, Jesus Christ is the great peacemaker. In the course of the Beatitudes, Jesus taught, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Well, Jesus is the greatest of all peacemakers because Jesus, through His death on the cross and His resurrection from the tomb, Jesus has effected peace between a sinless God and a sinful humanity. We have peace with God through Jesus Christ, verse 1. But now put with it verse 2. By whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand. I find the connections here very striking to what we see in 1 Peter 5 and verse 12. The true grace of God wherein ye stand, Peter wrote there, chapter 5, verse 12. Well, here Paul mentions we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand. You and I, who are New Testament Christians, we're citizens of the kingdom. We're members of the Lord's church. And we're standing in this grace, the Christian life. We enjoy that through Jesus Christ our Lord. And notice now what we anticipate. Verse 2 concludes, we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. You know, perhaps, just perhaps, we do not preach on this theme as much as we need to. Maybe I, Cliff Goodman, have not preached as much on the theme of the coming glory that will one day be ours. I'm convinced that as you and I live life on this earth, we need to do so with a view toward that glory. And here in Romans 5 and verse 2, Paul anticipates that glory, which will one day be possible only because of God's grace. And so it is, God's grace and our glory will be our study here tonight. Now, let's talk about the word glory. Glory is an interesting term to try to define because it has on one hand a very tangible or concrete dimension, but then on the other hand it has an intangible, abstract dimension. So if we were speaking of glory in the tangible manner, we would define glory simply as splendor or brightness. Splendor or brightness. We would think of glory very tangibly as being great light. But so often in the Scriptures, when we read of glory, probably the emphasis is more on the abstract than it is the concrete. And so regarding that dimension of glory, we've come to know that it means basically majesty and honor. Majesty and honor. Now, regarding God, we know the Scriptures teach that God is a being who dwells in the splendor and in the brightness of light. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 15. But we also know equally that God is clothed with majesty and honor. And so for our working definition here tonight, as we study the glory that one day we will enjoy because of God's grace, we're simply going to use the working definition, a most exalted state. A most exalted state. Friends, you know this. You know this as well as I. That the confines of my human vocabulary, they cannot adequately communicate to you the fullness of what glory will mean in heaven. So then please suffice me to say it is a most exalted state. It is a state that we might think of as one of splendor and brightness, but it's certainly one also of majesty and honor. It's a state that we want to enjoy, and we'll be able to enjoy it forever and ever as the faithful of God in eternity. Now, before we leave these thoughts and get into the body of our lesson, I do also need to point out that in lesser senses, the Bible speaks of there being a type of glory in this life. There are senses or examples in which people enjoy states of this life that are more or less exalted than other states. But suffice it to say here also that in every instance, the glory that one might enjoy upon this earth is nothing, and I repeat, nothing, compared with the glory that we will one day know in heaven. And you can consult Romans 8 and verse 18 along those lines. Now, these things being said by way of introduction, I only have 3 points tonight, and all 3 of these points come out of 1 Peter. So if you're open to Romans, go ahead and let's return now to our text. 1 Peter will begin in chapter 1 and verse 24, and there are 3 lessons regarding glory that I want us to see from this epistle. Lesson number 1. Earthly glory that I alluded to a moment ago, earthly glory is only temporary. And that's the first lesson. If there is a sense, and indeed there is, in which men and women might enjoy glory upon this earth, we need to temper that by noting it's only temporary. Look at 1 Peter 1 and verse 24 with me. Here Peter writes, "For all flesh is as grass." Now that's what you and I are clothed with. We have flesh and blood bodies, a fleshly existence during this life. All flesh is as grass. And the glory of man in this life, the glory of man as the flower of the grass. Now, if this verse ended right here, we might be left with a little bit of guesswork as to what Peter intended. Peter, what do you mean? That all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of us people is as the flower of the grass. What do you mean? But guess what? Verse 24 doesn't end that period, does it? Then there's more to verse 24, and because of it, we're not left to guess. Peter explains. He says, "The grass withereth, and the flower thereof falleth away." Ooh. That's kind of a bleak outlook. That's not really what we wanted to hear. The grass withereth. You and I know that our fleshly bodies are not going to hold up forever in this life. The old saying goes, none of us are getting out of this world alive, and we're not. Hebrews 9 and verse 27, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die," that is an appointment we will all keep, save our Lord comes back first. And in that event will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 50 and following. And so death is a reality. We experience death in our families. We have suffered it regarding our loved ones. And each of us ourselves one day will drink from that very fountain. We will one day drink from the fountain of death as we move from this earthly existence into eternity. And so all flesh is as grass, and the glory of man in this life is like a flower. Flowers are beautiful. We love flowers. We have gardens and we have flower beds. And for a season, those flowers are beautiful. But we know there's no such thing as a permanent flower. There's not a flower that can endure years, much less decades or even centuries. It eventually falls away. Now, as we make this first point, earthly glory is only temporary, I want us to look at 3 or 4 aspects, or 3 or 4 examples would be the better word, wherein there are areas that people have glory in this life, but they need to realize it's only temporary. It's only temporary. Number 1, go with me to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. Proverbs chapter 20. And find verse 29. The first example of this would be the glory of youth. The glory of youth. Look at Proverbs 20 and verse 29. The glory of young men is their strength, and the beauty of old men is the gray head. The glory of young men is their strength. You know what? Some people in this life, they become infatuated with the glory of youth. Why do you think throughout human history there has been the talk and the legend concerning a supposed fountain of youth? Why is that? Because throughout human history, people have been infatuated with it. In fact, I understand that the ancient Hellenistic culture, the culture of the ancient Greeks, they were preoccupied with youth. They basically worshipped youth in a sense. You know, it's really frightening The more you study ancient Hellenistic culture, the more you begin realizing that modern American thinking mirrors ancient Grecian thinking. And it's very, very frightening. You have the worship of youth, for one example, that we're presently dealing with. But then another example, just to make this point. In ancient Hellenistic culture, they were preoccupied also with athletics. They were very athletically minded, and they even practically idolized their athletic champions. Have you ever heard of that? You ever see that? I'm telling you, it's really quite scary if you do a study on the ancient Hellenistic mindset, how similar that is to the modern American mindset. And one example of that would be the worship of youth. Hey, there is a type of glory in youth. It's a beautiful thing to see young men and young women in the prime of their lives. That's beautiful. But I can tell you personally, it doesn't last. It doesn't last. The glory of youth is only temporary. Point number 2. The glory of riches, education, and power. That's all temporary. Look with me to Jeremiah chapter 9, also in the Old Bible. Jeremiah chapter 9. And let's talk about the glory of riches, the glory of education. So often education only comes through riches or through the expenditure of riches. And also the glory of power. Sometimes when people have education and they have money, they also find themselves to exercise a great deal of power. But look at Jeremiah 9 and verse 23. Thus saith the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. You and I might say, let not the educated man glory in his education. Neither let the mighty man, you and I might say, the man of power, the man of prominence, let him not glory in his might or in his strength. And then finally, let not the rich man glory in his riches. In all of these things, power or might, wisdom or education, riches and affluence, all of these things are things in life that many people glory in. But you know what? It's only temporary. It's only temporary. Riches, one day, I had an uncle who served for years. He served many, many years as an elder in the Lord's church. And he made a statement to me one time. I was scarcely 20 or 21 years of age. I'd only been preaching 3 or 4 years probably. And he made a statement to me that I've remembered ever since. He said, Cliff, he said, one day when this world burns, he said, every bit of money is going to burn up with it. You know what? He's right. Riches are just temporary. And in eternity, if we die outside of Christ, wrong in our relationship with God, no amount of money that we possess on this earth is going to correct that on the other side. And the same thing with education. I'm all for education. I've been blessed myself to get a small degree of education, and I'm thankful for that opportunity. But let me tell you, there are men whose office walls are littered with degree after degree, after diploma, after certificate. Their walls are littered. And you know what they say? They say there's no God. Speak of a rude awakening. When one's eyelids close finally in death, and the spirit man awakes on the other side, speak of a rude awakening. Friends, education, if it only serves to pull us away from God, instead of strengthening what we can do in service for God, that's useless. It's useless, and it's only temporary. And the same goes with power or with popularity. The glory that attends these things is temporal in its nature. But number 2, turn over with me now to the book of 1 John. And we're talking about earthly glory in various aspects. And I want us to see that all of these aspects are temporary. And from 1 John chapter 2, let's say something about the glory of pride. We've all known people who were especially renowned for their pride. Oh, sister so-and-so, she won't let you help her. But why not? She needs help. I want to know. She's a very proud woman. Brother so-and-so, he won't let you assist him with this now. He wants to be left alone and do it on his own. But why? He needs help. No, he's a very proud man. And so from an earthly perspective, many of us have come to view pride as a glorious thing. We think, this is an independent person. This is a self-respecting man or woman. And don't get me wrong, independence can be good and self-respect is needful. But there's a difference between those things and pride. There's a difference. Look in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16. Here we read from the Bible, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes," and here it is, "the pride of life." See, all of us, if we're not especially careful, we can succumb to this tendency that is here described as the pride of life. In Alabama, and you might know what I'm saying here in South Georgia, I don't know, but in Alabama, the term I use is fat and sassy. Many times people get fat and sassy on God's blessings. In other words, God is so incredibly good to us all. He blesses us and we become enriched and we become comfortable in life. And it's ironic that the very blessings that God grants are the blessings that in our warped way of thinking cause us to think that I don't need God or I don't need anybody else. The pride of life. The ASB uses the terminology vainglory, which makes my point. The vainglory of life. Whenever a man or a woman deems himself or herself to be self-sufficient, not needing God, not needing God's blessings or God's pattern or God's redemption, that's vainglory. It's only temporary. But then finally, as we conclude this first point, earthly glory is temporary. Whether it be youth or riches or education or pride. But in our day and time, we've even seen a lot of what I'm about to say next. Today, it's not uncommon to see people who glory in shameful things. Things that are not glorious in any sense. Things that are ugly and shameful. And for any of us who have a sense of morality, they would be embarrassing. Terribly, terribly embarrassing. And yet you turn on daytime television, which, by the way, I don't recommend. But you turn on daytime television, and people are on these talk shows, and they are glorying in their shame. Look at this. Go to Philippians with me. Philippians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. "For many walk," Paul said, "of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping." Paul says, I've told you about these. It brings tears to my eyes when I remind you of this, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ. Well, Paul describes such persons to us. Verse 19. "Whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly," they're self-serving in other words, "and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things." So I suppose if we're going to discuss earthly glory, we not only need to speak of some of those things that can perhaps be good or at least be put to good use, but we also need to consider some things that are very, very carnal, things that are very, very wicked and worldly, and yet we often see people in this world taking glory in those shameful things. Now, we noticed this, I think, maybe last night or the night before. What about those pleasures of sin? In Hebrews 11 and verse 25, are we not told they are but for a season? They're only temporary? Why glory in something that is going to have eternal consequences? Something that will condemn our souls in eternity. And why? For just a few moments or even a few years of pleasure upon this earth? Don't glory in shameful things. And so that's lesson number one. Earthly glory is only temporary. But now number two, as we go back to 1 Peter, the next this epistle brings out to me in my studies and that I want to share with you is that heavenly glory only comes after the suffering. Earthly glory is only temporary. We've established that. But now heavenly glory that we should really be seeking, that only comes after the suffering. And in 1 Peter we learned that this was exemplified by Jesus. Go with me to 1 Peter chapter 1. Notice verse 10 once more with me. Here Peter said, of which salvation, namely the salvation we enjoy today as Christians, he said the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, have inquired and searched diligently, who prophesied of the grace that should come unto you. Searching what or what manner of time the Spirit of Christ which was in them did signify, when it testified beforehand, notice, it testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ. You read that in passages like Psalm 16, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53. The list goes on and on and on. Old Testament prophets who foretold the sufferings of Christ, but not only the sufferings of Christ, also foretelling the glory that would follow those sufferings. And so even in our prime example, Jesus himself, what's the pattern? The pattern is sufferings first, glory later. And Jesus lived that. Jesus experienced that. Real quickly, go with me to Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24, and let's look at 25 and 26 here. Verse 25 says, then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Well, what did they speak, Lord? Ought not Christ to have suffered these things? Number one, suffering. And then number two, and then to enter into His glory. Luke 24, 25, and 26. And so number one under this, when we think about earthly suffering first, heavenly glory next, we see that very thing in the example of Christ. But here in 1 Peter, as we go back to 1 Peter, turning to chapter 4, Peter says it's going to be that way for us. It's going to be that way for us. Look at 1 Peter chapter 4, and let's read verses 13 and 14. Peter says, but rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers, you are participants of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. Notice that this glory is spoken of in a future tense. We're partakers of Christ's sufferings now, but His glory will one day be revealed, and we'll be glad then. Verse 14, if ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye. For the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part, He is evil spoken of by those in the world, but on your part, He is glorified. And so you skip down to verse 16, the famous verse. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. Heavenly glory comes after the suffering. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 17, Paul would write, and if children, then heirs. If we're children of God, then are we heirs also of the Father. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with Him, that we may be also glorified together. Now, that doesn't happen in this life per se. Verse 18, he says, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. Again, I think this is something we need to stress to our younger people. I think our little ones coming up, and then increasingly our teenagers in those formative years, I think all of us need to be reminded that, hey, living the Christian life is not something we do because it's easy. I'll stand up here and tell you tonight, as far as this life is concerned, there are a lot of different lifestyles that from an earthly perspective, might be easier to live. We don't live faithfully the Christian life because it's easy. And our young people need to know that. We choose to live the Christian life because it's worthwhile. It's the only life that's going to endure. It's the only one that's worth living. The glory is coming after a while. Now, there's a lesson we learn in this. Okay? And again, we learn it here in 1 Peter. We'll